A blizzard, one life, and 14 lives. The night of January 12, 1888, did not announce itself gently. It came the way catastrophe always does on the Kansas plains, fast, flat, and absolute. 1 hour the sky was pale and dry, the kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air like smoke. The next, a wall of white was moving across the open land at nearly 60 miles per hour, swallowing farmhouses, fences, and roads whole. Temperatures that had been sitting at a manageable 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius in the afternoon plummeted past minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 29 degrees Celsius by nightfall. The wind chill pushed the felt temperature down to nearly minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit minus 40 degrees Celsius. Historians would later call it the school children's blizzard, not for what it destroyed, but for who it caught unprepared. In the small settlement outside Abilene, Kansas, the storm did what storms do when human construction fails to respect physics. It exposed every weakness, every gap, every shortcut. Timber frame cabins that had passed through a dozen ordinary winters were now bleeding heat at a rate no hearth could recover. Families packed together under every blanket they owned, burning what they hadn't meant to touch until February. The draft in the standard open hearth fireplaces, so wide and shallow that they radiated warmth only to whoever stood directly in front of them, now worked backward, pulling frigid air in from the floor gaps and pushing precious heat straight up the flue. 2 neighboring households ran out of firewood before midnight. A third family burned chair legs and a wooden door frame to keep their children's fingers from freezing. And then on the eastern edge of the settlement, where the land dipped slightly before rising toward the old Brenner Road, there stood something that looked nothing like a house. A grain silo, cylindrical, stone-founded, perhaps 22 feet tall and 14 feet across at the widest point. Its original purpose had been the storage of surplus grain, but had not held a single bushel in 4 years. Now a thin ribbon of smoke rose from a short iron pipe emerging from its southern face, bending immediately sideways in the gale. A faint amber glow pressed against the interior of a single small window, roughly 6 inches square, cut into the stone near the base. Inside that silo, 14 people were alive, warm, and, by the account of at least one child who was present, singing quietly to pass the hours. Outside, the blizzard of 1888 was killing people across 3 states. The question that neighbors would ask for years afterward was not whether the silo had kept those 14 people safe. The evidence of that was plain. The question they kept returning to, the one that embarrassed them, was simpler. Why hadn't they believed her when she told them it would? Abilene, Kansas, autumn 1884. To understand what Maren Holst built, you have to understand what Maren Holst had been given, which was, by the autumn of 1884, almost nothing. She was 18 years old, the eldest daughter of Einar Holst, a Norwegian-born wheat farmer who had arrived in Dickinson County, Kansas, in the late 1870s with a team of oxen, a crate of hand tools, and a particular brand of stubborn optimism that the Kansas Land Board had been selling to European immigrants for the better part of a decade. Einar was not a cruel man. He was, however, a practical one. Practical in a way that men of that era often were when practicality came at the expense of their daughters. His second wife, a woman named Cordelia Pratt, arrived in the late summer of 1884 from Salina with 2 sons of her own and a clear understanding of what she wanted the Holst household to look like going forward. Within 3 weeks of the wedding, the shape of that household had become apparent to everyone, including Maren. By the first week of October, Maren had been given a bundle of her belongings, a cast-iron skillet, half a sack of cornmeal, and a pointed suggestion that she find her own arrangements. She was 18. She had no land in her name. She had no husband, no formal education beyond what the county schoolhouse had provided, and no male relative willing to take her in without conditions she wasn't prepared to accept. What she had, and this is the part the settlement would underestimate for the next 4 years, was an unusual habit of watching how things worked. Maren had spent her childhood observing. While other children played, she watched the way her father's chimney drew smoke differently depending on which direction the wind came from. She noticed at the corner of the root cellar where 2 stone walls met stayed warmer in winter than the flat center wall. She had noted, without having a language for it yet, that mass absorbed heat and released it slowly. That stone remembered warmth the way it never did. She arrived in the settlement outside Abilene with these observations and no place to sleep. The town of Abilene in 1884 was no longer the wild cattle terminus it had been in the early 1870s. The cattle drives had moved west. The saloons had quieted, and the population had shifted toward the more permanent and domestic project of turning the Kansas plains into farmland. It was a community of practical people who valued known methods: timber frame construction, standard open hearth fireplaces, sod or shingle roofing, and the kind of collective social memory that treated unfamiliar ideas with reflexive suspicion. No one offered Maren a cabin. What one older widow named Bertha sunned, herself a Norwegian immigrant who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted most of the people who had doubted her, offered instead was the use of a disused grain silo at the far edge of her property. It had good stone footings. The upper wooden structure had been partially replaced with stone block over the years. It was dry. "You can have it until spring," Bertha told her. "After that, we'll see." Maren looked at the silo for a long moment. Then she said something that Bertha would later repeat to her grandchildren more than once. "That's enough." Why settler cabins failed, and why almost nobody understood why. Before we follow Maren into the silo, it is worth pausing to understand the world she was building against, because the failure of settler housing on the Kansas plains in the 1880s was not a failure of effort. It was a failure of geometry. The standard settler cabin of the period was a rectangle, usually 1 room, sometimes 2, walls of timber or sod, typically between 6 and 10 inches thick. A single fireplace or cast iron stove positioned against one wall, most commonly near the center or at a gable end. The chimney ran straight up through the roof. The floor was packed earth or rough-cut planking laid over bare ground with little or no air gap. In moderate cold, this arrangement was adequate. In the deep, sustained cold of the Kansas blizzard, where temperatures could remain below -10 degrees Fahrenheit, -23 degrees Celsius for 3 to 5 consecutive days, it was not. The physics were straightforward, though few settlers had the vocabulary to describe them precisely. A rectangular cabin presented 4 flat walls surfaces to the wind. Wind pressure is not uniform, and on the open plains, it drives cold air through every gap in a flat wall, through the joint between log and chinking, through the seam where the sill plate meets a foundation, through the shrinkage cracks that opened every autumn as the timber dried and contracted. A typical timber cabin of this period, oral accounts suggest, could lose between 40% and 60% of its interior heat through air infiltration alone, not through the walls themselves, but through the gaps the wind found in them. The fireplace made it worse. Standard open hearth fireplaces of the era were designed to look impressive and to radiate heat forward, toward whoever was standing directly in front of them. Their efficiency as heating devices was, by modern analysis, remarkably poor. A wide, shallow firebox with no throat damper and no heat-exchanging mass meant that roughly 80% to 90% of the wood's thermal energy went straight up the flue. On a calm day, this was wasteful. During a blizzard, when the wind created unpredictable pressure differentials at the chimney cap, the draft could reverse entirely, pulling cold exterior air down into the cabin through the very structure meant to heat it. The result was a familiar pattern that local oral accounts describe with painful consistency. The family nearest the fire burned through twice the wood they planned to use and still slept cold. Those farther from the fire, in the sleeping corners in the loft, might as well have been outside. There was another problem, less visible but equally serious: thermal mass, or rather the complete absence of it. A timber frame cabin with wooden walls had very little capacity to store heat. Wood is a reasonable insulator. It resists heat transfer, but it does not absorb and re-radiate warmth the way dense stone or clay does. This meant that the moment the fire dropped below a certain temperature, when the family was asleep, when the wood ran low, the cabin interior cooled rapidly. There was no stored thermal energy in the walls to buffer the temperature. The air temperature and the wall surface temperature fell together, and they fell fast. A cord of firewood in 1884 cost between $3.50 and $5 in the Abilene area, according to local merchant records of the period. A typical settler family burning through a cord every 8 to 10 days during a hard winter, a rate oral accounts suggest was common in poorly built cabins, was spending money they did not have on warmth they could barely maintain. Maren had watched her father's cabin perform this particular failure every winter of her childhood. She had also, on a trip to Salina with her father in 1882, seen something that she could not stop thinking about: a stone mill building, massive and cylindrical at its base, that was being used as a temporary shelter during a late autumn storm. She remembered pressing her hand against the interior stone wall and being surprised to find it warm. Not hot, but warm, holding the remnant of 2 days prior when the sun had struck it directly. The stone remembered. She walked back to Bertha's son's silo and began to measure, the observation nobody else thought to make. The silo that Bertha's son had offered Marin was, in the language of agricultural history, a transitional structure, built in layers across nearly 2 decades, each layer reflecting the resources and skills available at the time of its construction. The foundation and lower 6 feet of wall were dressed limestone, dry stacked with small amount of clay mortar, cut from the same shallow bedded outcrops that underlay most of Dickinson County. Above that, a ring of rough sandstone block, more porous and lighter in color. Above that still, a section of original wooden stave construction, the kind that had been standard for grain storage in the 1860s and 1870s, patched and repatched with whatever Bertha's various hired men had found useful over the years. The diameter at the base was 14 feet, 2 inches, narrowing slightly to just under 13 feet at the wooden section. Total interior height was approximately 18 feet. The floor was stone flagged at the perimeter and packed earth at the center. It was cold inside, dark, and it smelled of old grain and mineral dust. Marin spent the first 2 days not building anything. She walked the circumference of the interior, pressing her palm flat against the wall at intervals, checking for gaps, watching the morning light to understand which face received the most direct sun. She noted that the southwestern quarter of the lower limestone wall, the section that received the most afternoon sun in late autumn, retained a faint warmth even at night, long after the air temperature inside had dropped. She noted that the curved wall had no corners, no right-angled joints where 2 flat surfaces met and created the infiltration pressure points that plagued every timber cabin in the county. She took measurements with a length of knotted cord she had calibrated against a known foot length. She drew a rough plan in the back of a worn ledger she had brought with her. Not a beautiful plan, but a logical one. Then she began to ask questions in town. She spoke with a German-born mason named Heinrich Voigt, who had come to Kansas from the Rhine Valley and who was, by local reputation, the most technically capable stone worker in the county. She asked him what he knew about how stone held and released heat. Voigt was initially dismissive. She was, after all, an 18-year-old girl asking a professional mason about his own trade. But she persisted, and eventually he told her what she wanted to know. For 1,000 pounds of dense limestone, he said, properly heated and sealed from drafts, would hold measurable warmth for between 6 and 10 hours after the fire dropped the coals. The denser the stone, the longer it held. Sandstone, being more porous, absorbed heat faster, but released it faster as well. Limestone was slower, more patient. It was, in Voigt's words, like a man who thinks before he speaks. Slower to act, but longer to forget. Marin wrote this down. She also spoke, somewhat awkwardly, with a Cheyenne woman named Wakia, who lived on the edge of the settlement and who was, local accounts suggest, largely ignored by the rest of the community. Wakia had spent years watching settlers build the same inefficient rectangles and had her own set of observations about heat, shelter geometry, and the way a curved wall redirected wind pressure rather than absorbing it directly. She told Marin about how the teepee's conical form was not incidental. It was engineered, refined across generations, to manage airflow and thermal convection simultaneously. Cold air entered at the base, circulated around the perimeter, rose with the heat of the central fire, and exited through the adjustable smoke flap at the apex. No dead air pockets. No pressure buildup. Marin listened carefully. She did not take credit for this knowledge. In later years, when neighbors asked her where the idea had come from, local oral accounts record that she consistently said the same thing. From a woman who knew more than the rest of us, and who none of us had the sense to listen to. By the 3rd week of October 1884, Marin had a plan for the silo conversion that drew on limestone thermal mass, circular wall geometry, ashen grass insulation packing, a corner-mounted firebox of her own design, and a convective airflow strategy that Wakia had helped her understand. She had $1.40 in savings, access to Bertha's son's scrap pile, and approximately 6 weeks before the first hard frost. She told Bertha what she intended to do. Bertha listened, nodded slowly, and said, "Well, I suppose we'll find out." The town would find out too, though not in the way most of them expected. How Maren turned a grain silo into a thermal engine. She started at the bottom. That was the first decision that separated what Maren was doing from everything else being built in the settlement at that time, and it was a decision rooted entirely in logic. Most settler construction of the 1880s began with the walls and treated the floor as an afterthought, something to be dealt with after the structure was standing. Maren reversed this. She had observed, over years of living in her father's cabin, that cold entered a room from the ground as much as it entered from the walls. That packed earth in deep winter was essentially a slow refrigerator pulling warmth downward from any living space above it. The stone flagging at the perimeter of the silo's floor was already an improvement over bare earth, but it was not enough. Over the course of 4 days in late October 1884, she extended the flagging toward the center of the silo using flat limestone slabs she pulled from a collapsed section of Bertha's son's old pasture wall. Stones that had been lying in the grass for years, absorbing nothing useful. She dry-fitted each slab carefully, filling the gaps between them with a mixture of clay and fine ash, tamped down firmly. The finished floor was not level. No frontier floor ever was, but it was continuous stone from wall to wall, approximately 14 feet across, with a total mass that Heinrich Voigt later estimated at somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 pounds. That floor, once heated, would not release its warmth quickly. It would hold it for hours. The next phase was the wall cavity. The wooden stave section in the upper third of the silo was the structure's most obvious thermal weakness. Thin-walled, drafty, and offering almost no resistance to wind infiltration. Maren could not replace it with stone. She did not have material, the time, or the ability to work at that height alone. What she could do, and did methodically, over 2 full weeks, was pack the gap between the interior face of the wooden staves and a secondary skin of woven river grass panels she constructed herself. The insulating fill she used was a mixture of dry wood ash and compressed grass, packed to a depth of between 4 and 6 inches around the entire circumference of the upper section. Wood ash's insulation was not a new idea. Frontier oral tradition records its use in various forms going back decades, but its application in a continuous packed layer within a wall cavity was, in this context, genuinely unusual. Ash has a thermal conductivity roughly comparable to dry earth. More importantly, it was free. Maren had access to the ash from Bertha's son's kitchen hearth, accumulated over years in a covered barrel outside the back door, and she used every pound of it. The firebox was the most technically demanding element of the conversion, and it is the part that Heinrich Voigt, when he came to inspect the work in progress, found himself unable to dismiss as easily as he had intended to. Maren had not built a standard open hearth fireplace. She had built what frontier records sometimes describe as a corner mass stove, though in this case, adapted for a cylindrical space with no true corners. She positioned the firebox against the southwestern interior wall, the section of limestone that received the most direct afternoon sun, and that she had already identified as the warmest quadrant of the structure. The firebox itself was a roughly cubic chamber of dressed sandstone block, approximately 20 inches on each side, with a cast-iron door salvaged from a broken cookstove that Bertha had stored in her barn. Behind and beside the firebox, she extended a thick backing mass of limestone, stone selected for density and fitted as tightly as she could manage, that wrapped the firebox on 3 sides and extended 18 inches into each adjacent wall section. The principle she was applying, whether she had articulated it in precisely these terms or not, was thermal mass radiation. The fire heated not just the air inside the silo, but the several hundred pounds of stone that surrounded it. That stone would continue radiating heat into the living space for 6 to 8 hours after the fire was reduced to coals. The air temperature might drop. The stone temperature would not. Not quickly. The flue she designed was narrow, deliberately so, no more than 6 inches in internal diameter, and ran in a gentle S-curve for the upper wall before exiting through the wooden section via a short iron pipe. A narrow flue slowed the draft, kept combustion gases in contact with the stone mass longer, and extracted more heat from each piece of burning before venting it to the outside. The trade-off was that the fire needed to be well established before the flue warmed enough to draw properly, and it required dry, dense hardwood to avoid creosote buildup. Marin accounted for this by sourcing split oak and hedge apple, Osage orange, from Bertha's woodpile, both dense enough to burn long and hot. By the second week of November 1884, with the first real frost already on the ground, the conversion was functionally complete. Marin had added a sleeping loft of rough-cut boards at a height of 7 feet, positioned to take advantage of the warm air that naturally stratified in the upper zone of the silo, and a simple insulated door of double planking with an ash fill between the layers, hung on hand-forged iron hinges that a sympathetic blacksmith named Odell Crane had made for her at reduced cost in exchange for 2 weeks of help keeping his account books. She lit the firebox for the first time on the evening of November 14th, 1884. The stone was cold and took nearly 3 hours to absorb enough heat to begin radiating. But by midnight, the interior temperature of the silo, measured by a small mercury thermometer Bertha's son, had lent her red 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 7 degrees Celsius. She was burning less than half a cord of wood per month. That girl is going to freeze before Christmas. Word traveled fast in a small settlement, and the word about Marin Holst's grain silo spread to the community outside Abilene with particular velocity that unusual things always find in tight-knit places. By December 1884, people were making the walk out to Bertha's son's eastern pasture, not to help, but to look, and more often than not, to offer their opinions. The opinions were not kind. The most vocal critic was a man named Rufus Allgate, a carpenter and self-appointed authority on frontier construction who had built or assisted in building a significant portion of the cabins in the surrounding area. Allgate was not a dishonest man, and his objections were not entirely without technical grounding, which made them more damaging than simple mockery would have been. He came to the silo on a cold afternoon in early December, walked around its circumference twice, peered through the small window, and then delivered his verdict to a small audience of neighbors who had accompanied him. The chimney pipe, he said, was too narrow. It would clog with creosote within a season and risk a chimney fire that, in a stone structure with a wooden upper section, could be catastrophic. The wall insulation, ash and grass, packed by hand, would settle and compress over winter, leaving dead air gaps that would undermine whatever thermal benefit Marin imagined it was providing. The sleeping loft was too close to the firebox, making the upper zone of the silo dangerously warm while the lower zone remained cold. And the whole project, he concluded, demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how heat actually moved in an enclosed space. That girl is going to freeze before Christmas, he said, and if she doesn't freeze, she'll burn. Several people nodded. A few laughed. One woman, accounts do not record her name, said that someone ought to speak to Bertha's son about liability. Allgate's critique was repeated and amplified over following weeks in the way that small community criticism always is, with additions, embellishments, and the gradual coalescence of individual doubts into something that felt like collective certainty. A farmer named Ira Goss told his wife that he had heard the silo's foundation was inadequate for winter frost heave, that the floor stones would shift and crack the wall by February. The blacksmith Odell Crane, who had made Marin's door hinges and privately thought her plan showed more engineering sense than most of what he saw built in the county, stayed quiet, not wanting to be associated with an idea that the community had already decided was foolish. Even Heinrich Voigt, the mason whose expertise Marin had consulted and whose knowledge of thermal mass had informed key elements of her design, declined to speak in her defense. He told a neighbor, according to local oral accounts, that the girl had good instincts but no training, and that instinct without training was a liability in a Kansas winter. Marin heard all of this. The settlement was not large enough for any of it to be kept from her. She continued burning split oak and hedge apple. She continued sleeping in the loft. She recorded the temperature inside the silo every morning in the back of her ledger, a practice she had begun on the first night of the fire and would maintain without interruption for the next 4 years. Her records, fragmentary but consistent, tell a story that the community certainly did not account for. On December 3rd, 1884, with an outside temperature of 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius and winds from the northwest, the interior of the silo at floor level read 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. At loft height, 7 feet up, it read 67 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees Celsius. She had burned approximately a quarter of a cord of wood in the preceding 2 weeks. By comparison, a neighbor whose name appears in adjacent farm records had burned through nearly a full cord of wood in the same period and reported that his cabin never got above 50 on the bad nights. Allgate's chimney clog prediction did not materialize. Marin had, by design, been burning only dry, dense wood, a precaution she had taken specifically because she knew the flue was narrow. The S-curve of the pipe allowed for manual cleaning from a single access point she had left open in the exterior wall, and she cleaned it every 3 weeks with a bundle of twisted wire she kept for the purpose. But none of this was visible to the community from the outside. What was visible was a cylindrical stone structure with a thin pipe of smoke rising from it, looking nothing like any proper home ought to look. In a settlement where appearance and conformity to known methods were proxies for reliability, that was enough. As Christmas passed and the New Year came in cold, the community's mockery settled into something quieter. Not retraction, but dormancy. They were waiting for Marin to fail. They were certain it was only a matter of time. They would have 3 more years to wait. 40 below, 14 people, and 3 days of proof. By January of 1888, Marin Holz had been living in a converted silo for more than 3 years. In that time, she had made incremental improvements. A second layer of stone added to the firebox mass in the autumn of 1885, a reinforced door with a clay stuff threshold seal in the winter of 1886, an improved ash collection system that fed dried material back into wall cavity as the original packing compressed. She had refined her wood consumption to a near science. On a still night at 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius, she could maintain an interior floor temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit 11 degrees Celsius and a loft temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit 20 degrees Celsius on a single evening fire of dense hardwood that she loaded before sleep and did not touch until morning. She had also, quietly and without announcement, become the person that neighbors with heating problems came to see, not openly, not in a way that required anyone to publicly revise their opinion of a project, but in the way that practical people eventually set aside their pride when something works and they need to know why. Ira Goss came to ask about ash insulation for his root cellar. A young couple named Peter and Sigrid Ahn came to ask about firebox placement for a cabin they were building. She answered all of them without commentary, without the satisfaction of saying she had told them so. Then January 12th arrived. The morning of the 12th had been deceptively mild. Temperatures around 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius. Skies pale and still, the kind of winter day that invited optimism. Children across the region had been sent to school. Farm families had set out to complete tasks they had been deferring for weeks. And then, just after noon, the temperature began to drop at a rate that no one who had not experienced it before could quite believe. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind had arrived from the northwest at sustained speeds of 40 to 50 miles per hour, carrying a wall of fine, blinding snow that reduced visibility to less than 3 feet. By 4 in the afternoon, it was already minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 23 degrees Celsius and falling. The settlement outside Abilene was not caught entirely unprepared. Word spread fast enough that most families reached shelter. But shelter meant very different things in different structures. The Goss cabin, with its thin sod walls and north-facing door, was holding at around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius by 7 in the evening, with a full fire burning. The Allgate house, Rufus Allgate's own well-built timber frame cabin, was doing somewhat better, but was burning through wood at a rate that its owner would later, quietly, admit had been alarming. 6 people arrived at Marin's silo in the first hour of the storm. A mother with 3 children whose cabin roof had partially failed under the wind load, and 2 farmhands who had been caught outside and could not reach their bunkhouse. Marin opened the door without hesitation. By 9 in the evening, 8 more had come. The Ahn couple, 3 members of a family whose fire had gone out and could not be restarted, and Bertha Sund herself, who at 71 years old had looked at the thermometer outside her kitchen window, looked at the snow driving sideways past the glass, and made a sensible decision. 14 people total, in a space 14 feet across. Marin fed the firebox with the largest pieces of dense oak she had. Split rounds, 8 to 10 inches across, the kind that burned for 4 hours without intervention. She sealed the door threshold with a rolled blanket. She directed people to the loft in groups, rotating them to ensure everyone spent time in the warmest zone. She rationed water from a sealed clay pot she kept near, but not touching the firebox mass, which maintained it just above freezing. She had 4 days' worth of dried corn hardtack and salt pork stored in a wooden box built into the base of the north wall, the coldest section of the silo, which she had converted into a natural cold larder. The storm lasted 71 hours. For the duration, the interior floor temperature of the silo did not drop below 48 degrees Fahrenheit 9 degrees Celsius. At loft height, it held between 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees Celsius, depending on how recently the fire had been fed. Total would consumed over the 3 days, approximately 2/3 of cord, a figure Marin recorded precisely in her ledger on the morning the wind finally dropped. For comparison, the Allgate cabin with 3 occupants burned through nearly a full cord in the same period and recorded interior temperatures that dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit -2 degrees Celsius, below freezing. On the second night, when the fire was briefly allowed to drop low, the Goss cabin, with the sod walls that Ira Goss had partially re-insulated with ash the previous autumn after his conversation with Marin, held at 38 degrees Fahrenheit 3 degrees Celsius, cold but survivable. 2 structures in the broader settlement that were not stone-founded and had not been insulated in any meaningful way were abandoned by their occupants during the storm. Both were subsequently found to have sustained damage from frozen water in the wall cavities, ice expansion that had cracked chinking, split sill plates, and in one case partially lifted a corner of the foundation. The silo had not moved. When the storm cleared on the morning of January 15th and the 14 people inside the silo emerged into a landscape of hard white silence and temperatures still hovering near -25 degrees Fahrenheit -32 degrees Celsius, the first person to speak, according to the account of young Peter On, was Rufus Allgate's eldest son, one of the farmhands who had come in from the cold on the first night. He looked at the silo, then at Marin, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "How long did you know?" Marin looked at the thermometer she had just read. 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius inside, despite hours without a fresh fire, and said, "Since the first night, what the plains forgot and what one woman remembered." The spring of 1888 arrived slowly, the way Kansas springs always did after a brutal winter, reluctantly, in fits, with cold snaps that reminded you not to trust a calendar. But when the ground softened enough to work, something changed in the settlement outside Abilene. People began to build differently. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen loudly. There were no public announcements, no formal acknowledgments, no moment in which the community gathered to say that Marin Holst had been right and they had been wrong. That is not how practical people on the frontier process being wrong. What happened instead was quieter, more durable, and in its own way more meaningful. They started copying her work. Peter and Sigrid On were first. That spring they began construction on a new cabin to replace their existing one, and they built a firebox with substantial limestone mass, nearly 600 pounds of dressed stone surrounding a compact firebox chamber, positioned in the northeast corner, where it would receive reflected heat from the adjacent wall. They packed the lower wall cavity with ash and dry grass to a depth of 5 inches. They did not build a cylinder, but they applied the principles: mass over surface area, insulation over air gap, dense fuel over frequent feeding. The Goss family expanded their ash insulation from the root cellar to the north wall of the main cabin that same summer. A newly arrived German farming family named Weckbecker, who had purchased land just east of Bertha's son's property and who had spent the blizzard huddled in the On cabin, built their first Kansas structure with a stone mass corner stove as the centerpiece of the design, reportedly after spending 2 afternoons talking with Marin through the silo window while she worked. Rufus Allgate did not come to Marin directly, but his son, the farmhand who had spent 3 days inside the silo and who had asked her on the morning of January 15th how long she had known, began an informal apprenticeship of sorts with Heinrich Voigt the following summer, focusing specifically on stone firebox construction and thermal mass placement. Voigt, by that point, had set aside whatever reservations he had once expressed about instinct without training. He had been inside the silo. He had read the thermometer himself. By the early 1890s, local accounts suggest that at least 11 structures in the surrounding area incorporated some form of stone thermal mass fireboxing or ash cavity wall insulation that traced directly or indirectly to Marin's conversion. The silo itself remained her home until 1897, when she married Odell Crane, the blacksmith who had made her door hinges in the autumn of 1884 and who had, in the intervening years, quietly admired both her work and her character from what he considered a respectful distance. She was 31 years old. She had lived in the silo for 13 winters. What Marin Holst understood, and what the settlement had refused to believe until a blizzard proved it, was not magic, and it was not genius in the formal sense. It was applied observation. It was a product of years spent watching how heat moved, how stone behaved, how wind found weakness in flat surfaces and redirected around curved ones. It was knowledge that existed in fragments all around her, in Voigt's professional experience, in Wakia's indigenous architectural tradition, in the simple evidence of her own hand pressed against a warm mill wall in Salina in 1882, and that she had the patience and necessity to assemble into something coherent. The principles she used have names now: thermal mass, radiant heat storage, convective stratification, passive solar gain. They are the foundational concepts of what modern architects call passive house design, buildings engineered to heat and cool themselves with minimal external energy input through careful manipulation of mass, geometry, insulation, and airflow. The most sophisticated passive house structures built today operate on principles that Marin Holst applied by necessity and observation. In a converted grain silo on the Kansas plains in 1884, she did not have the vocabulary. She had something better: the problem in front of her, and the willingness to solve it without waiting for permission. The silo still stood on Bertha Son's old property as late as 1923, according to a brief mention in a Dickinson County agricultural survey of that year. Its limestone foundation was described, in the surveyor's dry language, as sound and without observable settling. The wooden upper section had been replaced entirely with stone sometime in the early 1900s. By whose hands, the record does not say. The interior, the surveyor noted, was warm. He did not explain why. But then, by 1923, anyone who had grown up in that part of the county already knew. If this story made you think differently about what primitive really means, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and let us know which forgotten frontier technique you'd like us to uncover next. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of engineering history that the textbooks left out. Educational disclaimer: this video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.